This is problem number 69 from page 144. We are solving quadratic equations in this lesson. However, this equation is not a quadratic equation. It's a quartic equation. The highest degree here is 4, not 2. That means it's called quartic. But it looks a lot like a quadratic equation. I like to call it a quadratic in disguise. And we can solve it using methods we would solve for quadratic equations. And there are two different ways I'm going to show you to solve it. The first one is factoring, solving by factoring. So this happens to be a factorable expression here. We can factor it into 2x squared and x squared for the first, and into 5 and 1 for the last, minus and minus. And that works out. If you check by foiling, you'll get the correct middle term. And then you can set each factor equal to 0. Each of these equations can be solved by square rooting because this equation here does not have an x term. This equation here does not have an x term. So these are both perfect for the technique of square rooting, which is where you're going to isolate the x term. First add 5, then divide by 2, then square root. That gives us plus or minus square root 5 over square root 2. And because of the radical in the denominator, let's go ahead and rationalize this by multiplying by our special form of 1, square root 2 over square root 2. And that gives us plus or minus square root 10 over 2 as two solutions to the problem. And then going back to the second equation, we can add 1 to both sides and square root both sides. That gives us plus or minus square root 1. Well, square root 1 is just 1, so that gives us plus or minus 1. So we have 4 answers, and we use the technique of factoring. Here's a second method for solving this equation. Because it looks like a quadratic equation, it's a quadratic in disguise, as I like to call it, could we use the quadratic formula? The quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Oops. Where x, sorry about that, where the equation is ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Well, we cannot exactly use the quadratic formula because our equation has x to the 4th. The quadratic formula is based on an equation that has x squared, but we can modify it just a little bit. Instead of the regular quadratic formula, just change it to this. X squared equals the opposite of b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over 2a. So, solving the same problem again, we have x squared equals opposite of b over 2a would be 7 over 4 plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac would be the square root of 49 minus 4 times 2 times 5 over 2a would be over 4. So x squared equals 7/4 plus or minus, when you simplify that radical, you get square root 9 over 4. So x squared equals 7/4 plus or minus 3/4. Okay, so x squared equals 10/4 or 4/4, which is 1. Now we need to square root. So when you square root 10/4, you get plus or minus square root 10 over 2. And when you square root 1, you get plus or minus 1. same answers that we got doing it the other way. This is just another option for you.